Imagine you're sitting across from someone you care about. The conversation is calm, maybe even pleasant, and then they say something. It is not a long speech. It is not a deliberate attack. It might be a single sentence, maybe even a half-finished thought, but something about it lands differently than anything else said that evening. You feel it before you can name it. A tightening, a shift. And even though the rest of the conversation continues, even though dinner is eaten and the evening ends reasonably well, that one moment stays with you. You replay it on the drive home. You replay it before you fall asleep. You wake up the next morning and it is still there, waiting. You find yourself constructing explanations. Maybe they meant it this way. Maybe it was a signal. Maybe it reveals something about how they really see you. You build an entire interpretation around 12 words, and by the time a week has passed, those 12 words have become the defining fact of that relationship in your memory. The rest of the evening, the warmth, the laughter, the genuine moments of connection, those have faded considerably. But the sting remains vivid, almost fresh. This is not weakness. This is not oversensitivity. This is something the mind does with remarkable consistency across cultures, across ages, across every kind of human experience. And once you understand the mechanism behind it, you will begin to see it operating, not just in your memories of other people, but in your memories of jobs, of decisions, of entire chapters of your life. The uncomfortable truth is this: the story your memory tells you is not a recording, it is a reconstruction. And the reconstruction follows rules that have very little to do with accuracy. There is a principle in cognitive psychology that describes something most people have never been told about their own minds. It is called the peak end, and it may be quietly shaping how you remember almost everything that matters to you. The peak end rule describes a consistent pattern in how human beings evaluate experiences after they are over. Research in judgment and decision-making has shown that when a person reflects on a past experience, whether it was a conversation, a relationship, a vacation, a medical procedure, or a difficult period of life, they do not average out all the moments. They do not give equal weight to every hour or every interaction. Instead, the mind tends to anchor the memory of an experience on two specific points: the most emotionally intense moment, the peak, and the final moment, the end. Everything in between, the long middle, the ordinary stretches, the quiet and unremarkable hours, tends to be underweighted, sometimes dramatically. So this sounds at first like a minor quirk, a small inefficiency in how memory works, but the implications reach much further than most people expect, because memory is not just a record of the past. Memory is the raw material from which you build your sense of self, your understanding of relationships, your predictions about the future, and your willingness to try again. If your memory systematically distorts experience in a predictable direction, then the decisions you make based on those memories are also predictably distorted, and you will not feel the distortion happening. It will feel like clarity. It will feel like you're simply remembering what happened. To understand why the peak end rule exists, it helps to think about how the mind processes experience in real time versus how it processes experience in retrospect. These are genuinely different operations. The part of you that lives through an experience, the part that feels the warmth of a good conversation as it happens, the part that notices boredom during a long wait, the part that registers pain or pleasure moment by moment, that part is sometimes called the experiencing self. The experiencing self is honest in a narrow sense. It reports what is happening right now. It does not editorialize, it does not assign meaning, it simply registers the ongoing flow of moments. But the experiencing self does not write the story. That is the job of a different process, what is sometimes called the remembering self. The remembering self is the part of you that looks back. It is the part that answers when someone asks, how was that trip, or how is your relationship going, or was that job worth it? The remembering self constructs a narrative from the raw material of experience, and it does so quickly, efficiently, and with a strong preference for emotional peaks and final impressions. The problem is that the experiencing self and the remembering self often disagree. What was actually pleasant for the longest period of time may not be what the remembering self rates most highly. What was genuinely painful but ended well may be remembered as tolerable, and what was mostly fine but ended badly may be remembered as a failure. Consider a friendship that lasted several years. For most of that time, it was genuinely good. There were moments of real support, real laughter, real understanding, but toward the end, something shifted. There was a falling out, perhaps a single serious conflict, or a slow withdrawal that felt like rejection. The friendship ended on a cold note. Ask yourself honestly, how do you tend to remember that friendship now? Many people find that the ending casts a shadow backward over everything that came before. The years of warmth do not disappear from memory, but they feel somehow less real, less trustworthy, as if the ending revealed something that was always there. The remembering self has reweighted the entire experience around its final impression. Now, consider the reverse. A relationship that had serious problems for a long time, but ended gently. Perhaps the other person handled the ending with unusual grace. Perhaps there was one final conversation that felt honest and kind. People sometimes remember these relationships with a surprising degree of warmth, even when the actual experience measured day by day contained considerable pain. The ending softened the memory in a way that the daily reality did not earn. This is the peak end rule in action, and it is not a flaw that only certain people have. It is a structural feature of how human memory works. The implications for how you evaluate your own past are significant. Think about the period of your life that you now look back on with regret. A job you stayed in too long, a city you lived in that never felt quite right. A relationship that drained more than it gave. Ask yourself, when you remember that period, what moments come most easily to mind? Almost certainly it is the worst moments, the most painful, the most humiliating, the most frightening, and the final moments, the way it ended. The long, ordinary stretches, the mornings that were fine, the weeks that passed without incident, the small moments of genuine pleasure or connection that existed even within a difficult situation, those tend to recede. They are not dramatic enough to anchor the memory. This creates a particular kind of distortion. When you look back and say, that was a terrible time, you may be right. But you may also be remembering it through a lens that systematically emphasizes the worst and the last. The actual texture of that period, the full range of what you experience day to day, may have been considerably more varied than your memory now suggests. And this matters because you use those memories to make decisions. You use them to decide whether to try something similar again. You use them to judge whether you are capable of handling difficulty. You use them to define what kind of person you are and what kind of life you have lived. If the source material is distorted, the conclusions built from it will carry that distortion forward. The peak end rule also interacts with something called duration neglect. This is the tendency for the length of an experience to have surprisingly little influence on how it is remembered and evaluated. A difficult experience that lasted 3 weeks and a difficult experience that lasted 3 months may be remembered with similar intensity if they had similar peaks and similar endings. The extra time, all those additional days of difficulty, adds remarkably little to the remembered suffering. This seems counterintuitive. We tend to assume that longer suffering is proportionally worse suffering. But the remembering self does not keep a running total. It does not integrate over time. It samples, and it samples selectively from the most intense moments and the final moments. Duration neglect has a strange implication. It means that the length of a good experience may matter less than how it ends. A long, wonderful vacation that ends with a stressful missed flight and an argument at the airport may be remembered less favorably than a shorter trip that ended peacefully. Not because the short trip was objectively better, but because the ending carries disproportionate weight. This is where many people begin to feel something shift in how they understand their own dissatisfaction. Think about how many times you have evaluated an experience primarily by how it ended, a dinner that was mostly pleasant but finished with an awkward moment, a conversation that went well until the last few minutes, a project you worked hard on that ended with criticism rather than recognition. The ending pulled the memory downward even when the full experience deserved a more balanced assessment. Here's where this becomes more personal, because the peak-end rule does not only affect how you remember external events, it affects how you remember yourself. Think about a time when you were trying to change something about your behavior. You were trying to be more patient or more consistent or more honest, and for a stretch of time, you actually were. You made real progress. There were genuine moments of growth, but then came a bad day. A moment where you reverted completely to the old pattern, you snapped at someone, you avoided the difficult conversation. You broke the habit you had been building. And in the aftermath, how did you evaluate that entire effort? Many people find that one significant failure, especially if it comes near the end of an attempt, can erase the memory of all the progress that came before. The peak of failure and the end of the attempt fuse together, and the remembering self concludes, I tried and I failed. The weeks of genuine improvement become almost invisible. This is not an accurate assessment of what happened, but it is a psychologically predictable one, and it has consequences. Because if you believe you simply cannot change, you're less likely to try again. The distorted memory becomes a prediction. The prediction becomes a self-fulfilling pattern. The peak-end rule also shapes how you experience other people. When you think about someone you've had a complicated relationship with, a parent, a former partner, a friend who hurt you, you're not thinking about an average of all your interactions with them. You are thinking about the moments that were most emotionally charged and the way things ended or currently stand. This means your judgment of a person can be significantly influenced by a single terrible moment or a single final impression, even if that moment or impression was not representative of who they actually are across time. It also means that someone who treated you poorly for a long time but made a meaningful gesture at the end may receive more credit than they deserve. The remembering self is not a fair judge of other people. It is a judge that is heavily influenced by emotional intensity and recency. Understanding this does not mean you should dismiss your memories of how someone made you feel. Those feelings were real. But it does mean that your overall evaluation of a person or a relationship may be less accurate than it feels. It may be anchored in a few defining moments rather than in the full reality of what the relationship actually was. There is a secondary concept worth understanding here, and it connects directly to why the peak-end rule is so difficult to notice from the inside. It is called the narrative fallacy. The mind has a powerful drive to create coherent stories from fragmented information. When you look back at an experience, you do not retrieve a neutral record. You construct a story with a shape, a beginning, a middle, and an end, with causes and effects, with a meaning. The narrative fallacy means that the story feels complete and true even when it is built from selective pieces. The peak moments and the ending become the plot points around which the story is organized. Everything else becomes background detail or disappears entirely. This is why people can look back at the same relationship and construct genuinely different stories about what it was. Both people experienced the same events, but their peaks were different, their endings felt different, and so the stories they built are different. Neither story is a lie, but neither story is a complete record either. Both are reconstructions shaped by the same cognitive rules. The narrative fallacy also explains why hindsight feels so convincing. After an experience ends, the mind builds a story in which the ending was, in some sense, inevitable. The warning signs that were genuinely ambiguous at the time now seem obvious in retrospect. The decision that was genuinely uncertain now seems clearly wrong. The story has been organized around what happened, and the mind fills in a logic that makes the outcome feel like it should have been predictable. This creates a particular kind of self-criticism that is both very common and not entirely fair. When you look back and say, I should have known, you are judging your past self using information that your past self did not have. The certainty you feel now about what was obvious then is partly a product of how the remembering self constructs stories after the fact. Another concept that deepens this picture is what might be called the emotional anchoring of memory. Not all moments are equally likely to become peaks. The mind is particularly sensitive to negative emotional peaks. This connects to a broader pattern in human psychology. Negative experiences tend to be processed more deeply, remembered more vividly, and weighted more heavily than positive experiences of similar intensity. This is sometimes called negativity bias. It has a plausible evolutionary logic. An organism that remembered threats more vividly than pleasures was more likely to survive. But in everyday modern life, negativity bias interacts with the peak-end rule to create a consistent tilt in how experiences are remembered. The painful peak is more likely to become the defining peak. The difficult ending is more likely to color the entire memory. This means that two people can share an experience that was by any reasonable measure mostly positive. But if there was one significant negative moment, and if the experience ended on a low note, both people are likely to remember it as worse than it actually was. The positive majority of the experience is systematically underweighted. Now, understanding all of this is genuinely useful, but understanding alone does not automatically change how memory works. The remembering self will continue to construct its selective stories regardless of whether you know about the peak-end rule. What changes is your relationship to those stories. You gain the ability to question them before treating them as verdicts. Here is one of the most practical things you can do with this knowledge. When you find yourself evaluating a past experience, whether it is a relationship, a job, a decision, a period of your life, or your own behavior during a difficult time, try to deliberately slow down the story your mind is building. Ask yourself, what was the peak moment I'm anchoring this memory on? Was that moment genuinely representative of the whole experience, or was it an outlier? This is not about forcing yourself to see everything as positive. It is about recognizing that your memory has a structural tendency to anchor on extremes, and that a single extreme moment, however real, may not be the most accurate lens through which to judge an entire experience. A related practice is to think about duration more deliberately. Ask yourself, how long did the difficult part actually last compared to the rest? How much of this experience measured in actual time was the way I am now remembering all of it? You may find that the peak moment that is dominating your memory lasted hours, while the rest of the experience lasted weeks or months. That proportion matters even though the remembering self tends to ignore it. Another useful practice involves endings, because endings carry disproportionate weight. It is worth being intentional about how you close experiences when you have some control over it. This does not mean manufacturing false positivity at the end of something difficult, but it does mean recognizing that the last impression of an experience will likely have an outsized influence on how you remember the whole thing. If you're ending a difficult project, a difficult conversation, or a difficult period, and you have some choice about how that ending feels, it is worth treating that choice seriously. Not because the ending changes what actually happened, but because it will shape how your remembering self files the entire experience away. This applies to how you close conversations with people you care about. If a conversation has been tense but ends with a moment of genuine acknowledgement or warmth, the memory of that conversation will likely be softer than if it ends mid-conflict. The content of the conversation has not changed, but the ending shifts the weight. There is also something important to recognize about the stories you tell yourself about other people. When you find yourself making a sweeping judgment about someone based on a single interaction or a particularly painful moment, it is worth asking, am I evaluating this person based on a representative sample, or am I? anchoring on a peak. People are not their worst moments any more than they are their best moments. And the same is true of you. This does not mean ignoring genuine patterns of behavior. If someone has repeatedly treated you in a way that causes harm, that is a pattern worth taking seriously. But a single painful moment, even a very painful one, is not always a complete picture of who a person is. The peak-end rule can cause you to treat an outlier as a defining truth, and that can lead to decisions that are based on a distortion rather than a full account. One of the more counterintuitive implications of the peak-end rule involves how you might approach difficult experiences going forward. Because duration is underweighted, extending a moderately positive experience may do less for your future memory of it than you expect. And because endings matter so much, a relatively brief experience that ends on a genuinely meaningful note may be remembered more warmly than a much longer experience that fades out without resolution. This suggests that the quality of how you close things, conversations, relationships, projects, chapters of life, may deserve more attention than most people give it. Not as a manipulation of memory, but as a recognition that the mind will use those endings as anchors. Treating endings with care is a form of respect for the remembering self that will carry those moments forward. It is also worth being honest about the limits of these tools. Knowing about the peak-end rule will not make your painful memories disappear. It will not make the emotional intensity of a difficult moment feel smaller in the moment. And it will not give you perfect access to a neutral, complete record of your past. Memory is not a filing system that can be corrected with the right information. What it can do is create a small but meaningful gap between your memory and your verdict. Between the story the remembering self is constructing and the decision you make based on that story. That gap is where reflection lives. That gap is where you can ask, is this memory a reliable guide, or is it a reconstruction that is being shaped by a few intense moments and a final impression? The goal is not to distrust all of your memories. Most of the time, the stories your remembering self tells are useful enough. They help you navigate relationships, learn from experience, and make predictions about the future. The goal is to recognize the moments when those stories are doing something more specific, when they are collapsing a complex experience into a single emotional verdict, and to treat those moments with a little more care. Return now to the person sitting across from you, the one who said something that stayed with you. You have replayed it many times, you have built a story around it, and the story has started to feel like certainty. Here's what the peak-end rule asks you to consider. That moment was real, the feeling it produced was real, but it was one moment in a much longer experience. The question is whether that moment, however intense, is a fair representative of the whole. Whether the story your remembering self has built around it reflects the full texture of what you have actually experienced with this person, or whether it reflects the disproportionate weight the mind gives to emotional peaks and final impressions. You do not have to dismiss the moment. You do not have to pretend it did not happen or that it did not matter, but you might hold the verdict a little more loosely. You might ask whether the story your memory is telling is the only story that the evidence supports, or whether a more complete account would look somewhat different. This is what it means to understand your own mind. Not to override it, not to become coldly analytical about experiences that deserve to be felt, but to recognize when the automatic mechanisms of memory are quietly doing something that deserves a second look. The remembering self is not trying to deceive you. It is doing exactly what it was built to do. It is creating a workable story from a complex reality using the most emotionally salient information available. That is genuinely useful most of the time. But occasionally, the story it tells becomes a cage. It becomes the reason you will not try again. The reason you have decided what a person is. The reason you believe a chapter of your life was only one thing. And in those moments, the most important thing you can do is not to accept the story as final, but to ask whether it is complete. Better thinking does not mean feeling less. It does not mean treating every memory as suspect or every emotion as unreliable. It means building a small, honest habit of questioning the verdicts your mind delivers with the most confidence, because those are often the verdicts most shaped by peaks, by endings, and by the stories they're remembering. Self builds in the quiet space between what happened and what you decide it meant. If this gave you a new way to see your own memories and the judgments you build from them, consider subscribing for more videos on psychology, judgment, and the hidden patterns behind the way we think, feel, and decide.